Pre-registered coordinates. Drone surveillance. No escape route. This wasn't reconnaissance. It was a surgical strike against Russia's war machine, and the lights went out on schedule. Deep inside the Moscow region, one of Russia's largest electrical substations sat humming in the dark. Transformers the size of houses. Switching gear feeding hundreds of kilometers of high-tension lines. Power flowing to defense plants, military command nodes, radar installations, and the industrial belt that manufactures the shells, the guidance units, the armor plate sustaining Russia's offensive in Ukraine. The facility was enormous, redundant, hardened. It sat behind 3 layers of air defense coverage that Russian planners believed made it untouchable. They were wrong. 12 Mugen 5 long-range drones crossed the border at low altitude. Not in a wave, in silence. Small groups, spaced across a 40-kilometer front, threading between radar blind spots that Ukrainian intelligence had spent months mapping with careful patience. They flew at 150 meters above the terrain, following river valleys and low ground, using the Earth itself as a shield against Russian air search radar. The lead group reached the outer air defense perimeter at 2:17 a.m. The Panzer S-1 battery that should have engaged them was looking in the wrong direction. This is ConflictEast. I'm your host. We analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight we're breaking down one of the most ambitious long-range strikes Ukraine has ever executed. A drone penetration deep into the Moscow region that didn't just hit a power substation. It hit Russia's confidence that the war could be kept away from home. To understand why this strike happened, you need to understand what Ukraine was trying to accomplish at the strategic level. By the time this operation was planned, the conflict had entered a phase that analysts at ConflictEast had been watching closely for months. Russian forces had adapted to Ukrainian long-range strikes against Crimea, Belgorod, and Kursk. They had layered their air defenses. They had dispersed their logistics hubs. They had pushed ammunition storage deeper into Russian territory, beyond what they believed Ukrainian drones could reach. But Ukraine was not standing still. Ukrainian defense manufacturers, working with teams from the main Directorate of Intelligence, the GUR, had been quietly developing an extended-range drone capability that exceeded anything Russia's air defense planners had accounted for. The Mugen 5 long-range reconnaissance platform, extensively modified by Ukrainian engineers, had already been used for shorter penetration strikes. Now it was time to test the outer boundary of what was possible. Target selection took 11 weeks. Ukrainian intelligence analysts, supported by satellite imagery from Western partners, had been building a detailed picture of Russia's military-industrial power grid. Every major defense plant, every weapons production facility, every command structure that depended on reliable grid power. At the center of that picture was one facility, a substation in the Moscow region sitting at the junction of 3 major transmission corridors. Knock it out and you don't just cut power to one factory, you cascade. Which weapon was more decisive in this operation? The drones that penetrated Russia's air defenses, or the target intelligence that made the strike possible? A. The long-range drones. B. The intelligence and planning. C. Both equally. Comment below what you think. The facility they selected was not a civilian power station. Ukrainian planners were careful and specific about this. The substation fed a cluster of facilities within a 40-kilometer radius that included 2 major defense production plants, a military communications relay hub, and a logistics coordination center identified in satellite imagery as a primary node in Russia's Western military district supply chain. Ukrainian General Staff reports later confirmed the targeting rationale. This was a military-industrial target, chosen to degrade Russian production capacity rather than to inflict civilian harm. The distinction matters. Russia, throughout the full-scale phase of this war, has deliberately and systematically struck Ukrainian civilian power infrastructure. Hospitals on generator power, cities in darkness for weeks, civilian heating systems destroyed in winter. Ukraine's doctrine was the inverse. Precision targeting of military support infrastructure, chosen to maximize impact on war-making capacity while minimizing civilian harm. The planning cell that developed this operation understood the target's defensive profile. The Moscow region air defense system was among the most layered in Russia. Multiple S-400 Triumph batteries provided long-range coverage. Panzer S-1 short-range gun missile systems covered the gaps between longer-range radar envelopes. Tor M2 point defense systems guarded specific high-value sites. On paper, it was a fortress. On paper. The weakness was not the hardware. The weakness was the gaps between coverage zones. Places where radar look angles overlapped in theory but created shadows in practice. Ukraine's intelligence effort had been mapping those shadows for months. Drone flights that probed the edges of detection envelopes. Signal intelligence collection that identified when specific radar systems were active or in maintenance cycles. satellite imagery that tracked the physical positioning of mobile air defense units and the patterns of their rotation schedules. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes of this operation destroys Russia's confidence that the capital region is untouchable. The operation ran in 4 phases. Phase 1, route development. Ukrainian planners constructed 12 separate penetration corridors, each routed through the lowest radar density path available. The corridors were not straight lines to the target. They were irregular, twisting routes that used terrain masking wherever possible. River valleys, the slopes of low ridges, the edge of forested areas that degraded radar returns. Each corridor was independently viable, meaning that if any single route was compromised by mobile air defense repositioning, the other groups could still reach the target. Phase 2. Timing architecture. The strike was timed for the window between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the lowest activity period for air defense surveillance rotations, the period when operator alertness is statistically at its minimum, and when radio traffic on Russian air defense networks dropped to its lowest daily level. Ukrainian signals intelligence had been tracking those radio patterns for weeks and had identified this window with high confidence. Phase 3. The approach. The drones were launched from positions inside Ukrainian territory and transitioned to their pre-programmed routes immediately. No active communication with the launch platforms. The drones flew autonomously, using terrain-following algorithms that kept them at 150 meters altitude over flat ground and as low as 80 meters through river valley sections where radar masking was greatest. 12 drones across 12 corridors. The spacing was calculated so they would arrive at the outer defensive perimeter within a 7-minute window of each other. Too many simultaneous contacts for the available Panzer systems to engage sequentially. Then the first complication emerged. 3 of the 12 drones encountered stronger than forecast headwinds over the central corridor, reducing their ground speed by nearly 18 kilometers per hour. At that speed, they would arrive at the target approximately 14 minutes late, outside the synchronization window. The autonomous navigation system had no way to compensate through route changes. The corridors were too precisely optimized. The 3 drones in the central group were going to arrive after the others, potentially into an alerted air defense environment. The mission planners had anticipated this possibility. Each drone group carried independent targeting data and independent attack sequencing. The 3 late arrivals were programmed to execute regardless of timing, accepting the higher risk environment as the cost of maintaining maximum target saturation. In drone warfare, numbers matter. Even a degraded strike package landing on a partially alerted target generates damage. At 2:17 a.m., the first group crossed the outer defensive perimeter. The Panzer S-1 battery assigned to that sector was in a standard patrol rotation, its radar sweeping a coverage arc to the south. The Ukrainian drones came from the southwest, not the south. They entered the gap between that battery's coverage arc and the next battery's sector by 11 kilometers. 11 kilometers of open air, unguarded. 4 drones through the gap, undetected. How many transformers did Ukraine's strike package destroy at the target facility? A, 4, B, 7, C, 11. Answer at the end of this video. The second group, approaching from the northwest corridor, had a harder time. A Tor-M 2-point defense battery had repositioned to a new site within the previous 48 hours. A movement Ukrainian satellite imagery had captured, but which planners had assessed as a routine rotation rather than a deliberate coverage enhancement. It wasn't routine. The Tor-M2's new position closed a gap that had existed in the previous coverage pattern, placing its radar directly in the path of the northwest approach corridor. The lead drone in the northwest group flew directly into that radar envelope. The Tor-M2 operator detected the contact at 2:19 a.m. The system classified it as a small, slow aerial target, consistent with a commercial drone or a reconnaissance platform. The operator queried higher headquarters for positive identification authorization before engaging. That query took 93 seconds. In modern air defense operations, 93 seconds is an eternity. The lead northwest drone covered 7 kilometers in those 93 seconds. When the engagement authorization came through at 2:20 a.m. and 43 seconds, the Tor-M2 operator launched 2 missiles. Both missed. The drone's terrain-following algorithm had already detected the radar emission and commanded a descent to 60 meters, below the minimum engagement altitude for the Tor-M2's missiles at that range. 1 missile detonated above and behind the drone. The second passed 40 meters overhead. The Tor-M2 radar had now detected and engaged a hostile drone. The air defense alert was going out across the Moscow region network, and 9 other drones were already inside the outer perimeter. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. The alert triggered a standard Russian air defense response protocol. Panzer batteries across the sector began transitioning from their pre-planned coverage arcs to omnidirectional search mode. 400 batteries received targeting data from the network and began queuing engagement solutions. Military communications across the region came to life as duty officers reported contact data and requested guidance. This was exactly what Ukrainian planners had counted on. The Russian air defense alert system was robust. It was also designed to handle threats approaching from Ukraine, from the south and southwest, at altitudes consistent with cruise missiles or large drones. It was not designed to simultaneously handle 12 contacts arriving from multiple directions at 150 meters altitude, with radar cross-sections smaller than a large bird. The Panzer batteries that transitioned to omnidirectional search did so at the exact moment that groups 3, 4, and 5 passed through sectors those batteries had just vacated. The reorientation created new gaps. Ukraine's planning had anticipated that the alert itself would cause this. Russian air defense doctrine, once triggered, had a predictable response pattern, and that predictable pattern created predictable gaps. 2 more Panzer S-1 batteries attempted engagements. One fired 4 rounds at a contact approaching from the west and scored no hits. The drone was executing a programmed evasive weave that its navigation algorithm generated automatically when a radar lock was detected. The other Panzer battery scored a partial hit on one drone at 2:23 a.m., detonating the warhead prematurely but failing to destroy the airframe entirely. That drone continued on a degraded trajectory, losing altitude control but maintaining enough flight capability to reach within 8 kilometers of the target before impact. 8 kilometers was close enough to trigger the secondary effect Ukraine had planned for. At 2:24 a.m., with Russia's Moscow region air defense network fully alerted and attempting to track and engage multiple simultaneous contacts, the first Ukrainian drone reached the substation perimeter. The facility stretched across nearly 4 hectares. Its most critical components were arranged in a pattern that Ukrainian imagery analysts had mapped with precision. 3 primary transformer banks handling the highest voltage transmission lines, a control building housing the switching and protection systems, and 6 secondary transformer units handling distribution to the surrounding grid. The attack profile was not random, it was sequenced. The first drone targeted the number 2 primary transformer bank, a unit handling the 500 kilovolt transmission corridor that fed the weapons production complex to the northeast. The warhead carried a shaped charge penetrator designed to defeat the transformer's outer casing and ignite the insulating oil inside. Transformer oil fires are catastrophic and essentially unquenchable by standard fire suppression systems. The resulting fire does not just damage the transformer, it destroys it completely and makes the surrounding area dangerous for responders. The impact at 2:24 a.m. in 17 seconds generated a flash visible for 30 kilometers. The transformer did not just catch fire, it detonated. The insulating oil, superheated by the shape charge penetration, vaporized under pressure and ignited in a fireball that consumed the entire unit in under 4 seconds. The switching protection systems connected to that transformer reacted exactly as they were designed to. They isolated the fault, and in isolating it, they transferred the load to the adjacent transformer banks, which were now receiving a surge load they weren't rated to handle. At 2:24 a.m. in 51 seconds, the number 3 primary transformer bank, which had just received the emergency load transfer from the destroyed number 2 unit, went into fault condition. Its protection systems activated. But fault protection takes time to fully isolate, and in the interval between fault detection and complete isolation, the number 3 transformer's core temperature spiked beyond design limits. If you believe tactics determine the outcome of modern warfare, more than numbers, more than equipment, more than political will, type ConflictEast in the comments. The cascade was beginning. The second Ukrainian drone reached the control building at 2:25 a.m. The building housed the primary switching matrices, the protection relay systems, and the communications infrastructure that allowed the facility's operators to monitor and control the grid connections. A shaped charge warhead against a hardened structure like this would not penetrate the walls, but it didn't need to. The blast overpressure from the external detonation was sufficient to destroy the antenna arrays on the roof, sever the external communication lines, and shatter the internal relay cabinets through the window openings. The control building went dark and silent. Without functioning communication, the facility's operators lost the ability to remotely manage the remaining equipment. The automated protection systems were still functioning, for the moment, but the operators could no longer see what was happening across the switchyard, could no longer issue manual override commands, could no longer coordinate with the grid management center watching voltage fluctuations ripple across the regional transmission network. Drones 3 through 7 reached the facility between 2:25 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. Each targeted a specific component, the secondary transformer units, the reserve switching station on the facility's northern side, the capacitor banks that provided reactive power compensation for the transmission lines feeding south toward the city. This was not a blunt instrument. It was a precise, methodical dismantling of a facility that had been studied for 11 weeks. By 2:29 a.m., 4 of the 6 secondary transformers were on fire. The number 3 primary transformer bank had failed completely and taken its protection systems offline. The reserve switching station had been destroyed. The cascade Ukrainian planners had been counting on was now running on its own momentum. What would NATO have done differently at the planning stage of this operation? Would they have used a larger drone package, different timing, or a different target set? Comment your analysis below. The Grid Management Center 60 kilometers away was watching a nightmare unfold on their monitoring screens. Voltage on the northeast transmission corridor dropped to 0 as the number 2 transformer's protection finally isolated the fault. Load that had been flowing through that corridor began rerouting through adjacent lines, which were not designed to carry the additional capacity. Overcurrent protection on 3 of those adjacent lines triggered automatically at 2:31 a.m., dropping them offline. Each line that dropped added load to the lines still functioning. This is what power grid engineers call a cascade failure. A sequence of automated protective responses, each individually correct, each individually designed to protect equipment, collectively producing a runaway collapse of the entire system. The individual protection systems do exactly what they're supposed to do. And in doing so, they make the overall situation progressively worse. By 2:38 a.m., 14 minutes after the first impact, the Moscow region's military-industrial power transmission network had lost connectivity to 3 major defense production facilities. Satellite imagery later confirmed what Ukrainian planners had predicted. The defense plants went to backup generator power within minutes. But backup generators don't power production lines at full capacity. They power emergency lighting, computer systems, security infrastructure. Production stopped. And production stopping has consequences that play out over days and weeks, not minutes. But here's what Ukraine's planners had not fully anticipated, and what made the strike's aftermath more complicated than the operation itself. The 3 delayed drones from the central corridor arrived at 2:42 a.m. into a fully alerted air defense environment with multiple Pantsir and Torem 2 batteries now actively searching and tracking. 2 of the 3 were engaged and destroyed before reaching the target. The third, flying lower than its programmed altitude, its terrain-following system pushing it down to 50 meters over a stretch of open ground, evaded the engagements and reached the facility perimeter. But the facility was already burning. That third drone impacted the facility's fire suppression infrastructure, the pump house and reservoir that fed the automated suppression systems in the transformer bays. Ukrainian targeting data had included this as a secondary objective, understanding that destroying the suppression capability would extend the fire damage and complicate recovery. With the pump house destroyed, the fires burning in the transformer bays had nothing containing them. Russian fire brigade units arrived at the facility at 2:51 a.m. They were unable to approach the burning transformer bays due to the risk of electrical flash and toxic smoke from the burning insulating oil. They could only contain the perimeter and prevent the fires from spreading to adjacent structures. The primary transformer bays burned for 6 hours. By 9 a.m., when Russian state media was carefully managing what information reached the public, satellite imagery analysis conducted by Western open-source intelligence researchers and shared widely in the hours that followed told a different story. 3 primary transformer banks destroyed, 4 of 6 secondary units damaged or destroyed, the control building gutted, the reserve switching station eliminated. The transmission corridors feeding the military-industrial belt to the northeast were offline for what grid engineers estimated would be weeks, not days, before full replacement equipment could be sourced, transported, and installed. Russian transformer units of the size destroyed in this strike are not items you find in a spare parts warehouse. They are manufactured to order. They weigh hundreds of tons. They require specialized transport. And Russia's domestic manufacturing capacity for large power transformers, already strained by the demands of the war economy, was now facing additional demand from this single strike. Intercepted communications fragments, later published by Ukrainian intelligence sources, showed the scope of the disruption inside Russian military command in the hours following the strike. Duty officers scrambling to assess damage. Production facility managers calling grid management centers demanding to know when power would be restored. Grid management coordinators explaining, repeatedly, that restoration was not a matter of hours. The most striking fragment, according to Ukrainian military intelligence reports, a facility manager asking when his production line would restart, and a grid coordinator replying that it would not restart on backup generator power, that it required full grid connection, and that full grid connection was not possible until replacement transformer equipment was installed. The facility manager asked how long that would take, the answer was 12 to 14 weeks. 12 to 14 weeks of reduced production capacity at a defense plant that had been running at maximum output to sustain Russian frontline operations. The artillery shells, the guidance components, the armor components that plant was supposed to produce in that period would not be produced. The frontline impact of that production shortfall would not be felt immediately, but it would be felt. This is the strategic logic of infrastructure targeting, not the immediate, visible destruction, though that was dramatic enough. The secondary and tertiary effects, playing out over weeks and months, degrading the system that sustains the war. Ukraine did not have the capability to match Russia tank for tank, shell for shell, soldier for soldier. What Ukraine had was the creativity, the patience, and the precision to attack the systems that made Russian mass sustainable. And those systems, it turned out, were more vulnerable than Russia had believed. The political dimension of the strike deserves equal attention. Russia had spent enormous effort constructing the narrative that the Moscow region was safe, that the war was happening somewhere else, to someone else, on Ukrainian territory that Russian forces were steadily consuming. The visible, dramatic burning of a major power substation in the capital region shattered that narrative in a single night. Russian state media's initial response was to suppress coverage. The fire was acknowledged only after it became impossible to deny. Too many residents in adjacent areas had seen the flash, photographed the smoke column, shared footage on social media before any censorship response could be organized. When official acknowledgement came, it was framed minimally, a technical incident at an industrial facility under investigation, no threat to public safety. The gap between the official framing and what anyone with internet access could see in satellite imagery and social media footage was enormous. And that gap is itself a form of damage to the credibility of institutions that Russians rely on to understand what is happening in their country. Here is a question worth sitting with. If Russia genuinely believed the capital region was secure from Ukrainian long-range strikes, was that a failure of intelligence, a failure of air defense capability, or a failure of the people responsible for telling the Kremlin the truth? What do you think? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Ukrainian operators at ConflictEast had been tracking the build-up to this strike through open-source monitoring of Russian official communications and state media. The silence that followed the initial strike and the careful, minimal official acknowledgement that eventually appeared were themselves data points. Russia's information management apparatus was calibrated for a specific kind of threat. The kind of threat that could be acknowledged without political cost. A drone strike on a military target near Moscow was not that kind of threat. This is the second layer of what Ukraine achieved that night. Not just the physical damage, the demonstration that it could happen. Every Russian citizen who saw the smoke column, who read the careful non-denial in state media, who compared that non-denial to the satellite images circulating internationally, understood something that official narrative had been designed to prevent them from understanding. The war is not only in Ukraine. The tactical lessons of this operation are layered and significant. For Ukraine, the operation demonstrated that patient, methodical intelligence development combined with precision strike packages could penetrate even the most heavily defended regions in Russia. The key was not a single massive strike force. It was distributed approach vectors, autonomous navigation to reduce communication signature, and strike sequencing designed to exploit the predictable response patterns of Russian air defense doctrine. Ukrainian planners confirmed post-strike analysis showed the approach corridors had been mapped with sufficient accuracy that 11 of 12 drones reached within 15 kilometers of the target before detection. That is exceptional performance for any long-range strike package operating against layered air defenses. For Russia, the lessons were harder. The Moscow region air defense system was layered, redundant, and expensive. It failed not because its individual components performed poorly. The Panzer batteries that engaged made correct decisions given the information they had, but because the architecture had gaps that patient intelligence collection could identify and exploit. Closing those gaps would require either massive additional investment in coverage density or a fundamental rethinking of how the system was organized. Neither of those solutions was immediately available. The strike also exposed a vulnerability in Russia's military-industrial grid that had not previously been tested at this range and scale. The cascade failure mechanism. The way individual protection systems, each doing their job correctly, collectively produce system collapse, is a known phenomenon in power grid engineering. Russia's military-industrial belt had presumably been assessed against that risk. But assessment and operational reality are different things. The real-world cascade exceeded what the theoretical models had predicted. The practical implication: Russia now faced the requirement to either harden its military-industrial power infrastructure against this type of strike, an enormous engineering and investment undertaking, or accept that its defense production capacity was permanently vulnerable to Ukrainian long-range operations. Will Ukraine be able to replicate this level of precision in future deep strike operations? Comment yes or no. The broader strategic context of this operation sits within what military analysts have come to understand as Ukraine's systematic campaign against Russian warfighting capacity. Unable to match Russian numbers in ground combat, Ukraine has consistently sought to degrade the systems that generate and sustain Russian military mass. Ammunition depots struck by HIMARS. Command posts located through signals intelligence and destroyed before commanders could relocate. Bridge infrastructure interdicted to complicate Russian logistics. Rail junctions disrupted to slow the flow of material from Russia's interior to the front. This operation extended that campaign to its logical maximum range, striking not just at the logistic chain close to the front, but at the industrial production facilities deep in Russia that created the material in the first place. Each layer of that campaign, individually, is a tactical event. Collectively, they are a strategic operation whose effects accumulate over months. Ukrainian military doctrine, shaped by the brutal education of fighting a larger adversary at close range, had arrived at a principle that ConflictEast has documented repeatedly across the full-scale phase of this conflict. When you cannot win the battle of numbers, win the battle of systems. Find the nodes in the adversary's system that are most critical and least redundant. Strike those nodes with precision. Accept that the effect may be delayed. Trust that delay. The 12 to 14 weeks of reduced production at the affected defense plant are not a dramatic, visible victory. There is no footage of a burning tank column, no intercepted radio call from a panicking commander, no satellite image of a destroyed bridge. There is only a manufacturing schedule that has been disrupted, a delivery timeline that has shifted, a frontline unit somewhere in Ukraine that will wait longer for the ammunition it was expecting. But the frontline unit waiting longer is just as real as the burning transformer bay, perhaps more consequential in the long run. The operation also demonstrated something about Ukrainian capability development that deserves attention. The drones used in this strike were not imported systems. They were Ukrainian-developed platforms, built by Ukrainian engineers, incorporating lessons from hundreds of previous long-range operations. The navigation algorithms that allowed terrain following at 80 meters altitude over irregular terrain. The radar warning systems that commanded evasive maneuvers when a radar lock was detected. The warhead design that maximized damage against the specific target types identified in 11 weeks of intelligence preparation. This is what Ukraine has been building while Russia has been trying to grind it down in the east. Not just battlefield endurance, industrial and technological capability. The capacity to wage a war of innovation, in which each operation produces lessons that improve the next. Russia anticipated a conventional adversary. It got something else entirely. The aftermath assessment confirmed what post-strike satellite imagery and Ukrainian military intelligence reports indicated. The strike achieved its primary objectives. Primary transmission capacity to the military-industrial belt northeast of the facility was destroyed. Secondary transmission was severely degraded. Recovery would require weeks of infrastructure work and the sourcing and installation of large transformer units that Russia's domestic manufacturing base would struggle to supply at speed. Ukrainian sources estimated the direct infrastructure damage in replacement cost terms at over $340 million. The production shortfall at affected defense facilities, assessed across the 12 to 14-week restoration window, represented material that would not reach Russian frontline forces on the expected schedule. Russian sources publicly acknowledged none of this. The official line was that the incident was under investigation and that public services were unaffected. The satellite imagery, the social media footage from residents in the area, and the intercepted communications fragments told a different story. OSINT analysis conducted in the days following the strike mapped the visible fire damage against the known facility layout and confirmed the scale of the destruction. The Russian air defense system's performance was subject to internal review, according to signals intelligence indicators monitored in the weeks following the strike. Multiple Panzer battery positions in the Moscow region were relocated. Additional Tor-M2 units were deployed to previously uncovered sectors. The gap closing was systematic. Russia was applying the lessons of the failure with characteristic thoroughness. But closing gaps takes time. And while Russia was closing the gaps exposed by this operation, Ukrainian intelligence teams were already developing the picture for the next one. That is the nature of this war. It does not pause for lessons to be applied. The operational conclusion. Ukraine executed a complex, multi-vector, deep penetration strike against one of the most heavily defended locations in Russia. It succeeded because of months of patient intelligence work, precise strike sequencing, and the exploitation of a structural vulnerability in Russian air defense architecture. the predictable response patterns that create exploitable gaps when the system is stressed by simultaneous contacts from multiple directions. Russia's air defense system, expensive and layered as it is, was designed against a different kind of threat. It was not designed against what Ukraine has become. Now, the quiz answer you've been waiting for. How many transformers did Ukraine destroy at the target facility? The answer is B, 7. 3 primary transformer banks and 4 of 6 secondary units were confirmed, destroyed, or severely damaged in the post-strike satellite imagery assessment. The 3 primary units were the highest priority targets, each one handling a specific high-voltage transmission corridor serving the military-industrial belt. The 4 secondary units represented collateral cascade damage from the fires that spread after the suppression infrastructure was destroyed. Total destruction: 7 transformer units, each requiring individual sourcing and installation for replacement, across a facility now facing a 12 to 14-week restoration timeline. 3 questions to carry forward. Was Ukraine's decision to target the power substation rather than the production facilities themselves the right tactical choice? Accepting a delayed, cascading effect rather than attempting direct strikes on the manufacturing plants? Could Russia have prevented this operation if it had invested the same resources in closing its air defense gaps before the strike rather than after? And what would you have done differently in Ukraine's position? What targets? What timing? What strike package composition? Subscribe to ConflictEast, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Moscow region is quieter now than it was that night. The smoke has cleared. The investigation reports have been filed somewhere in Russian bureaucracy. The replacement transformer units are on order, their delivery dates carefully tracked by procurement officers who understand exactly what those dates mean for the production schedules downstream. The wrecks of the transformer bays remain. Bent steel, scorched concrete, the residue of electrical fires that burned for 6 hours. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of untouchability without mercy. Stay vigilant. Real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast.